Welcome to the Tokenomics DAO podcast, where we explore everything tokenomics related, ranging from deep dives on the tokenomics of the newest protocol to demystifying the nuance of building a successful token ecosystem. Our goal is to bring awareness to the importance of tokenomics and the crucial role it plays in defining the success of a protocol, helping make tokenomics relevant for everyone, builders and investors alike. I'm your host, Flo, joined by my co-hosts, Jason and or Lovis. Welcome to the podcast. So today on the Tokenomics DAO podcast, I've got Lucas and Nihar from Jump Crypto. The guys have written a nice article a while back, and it's called Token Design for Serious People, introducing some guidelines or some framework to analyze tokenomics. And I thought you guys can just kick it off by giving a short intro each, and then maybe one of you doing like a short Eli 5 TLDR of the article, and then we can jump into a few of the aspects that you've covered. Lucas, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I'm on the research and investments team at Jump, where I split my time between, on the one side, tokenomics, governance, DAO structures, various topics around the ecosystem, and on the other side, do a lot of infrastructure work. So generally looking at the long-term themes, the overall evolution of the crypto ecosystem over the medium to long-term horizon.
Cool, Nihar. What do you got?
Flo, thanks very much for having us on the podcast. So, Lucas and I have sort of very similar roles here at Jump. We both, spend a lot of time on the research and development side of things. More generally, Jump, as just a little bit of context, is it's a large global trading firm that has a lot of historical expertise trading all sorts of markets, commodities, futures, equities, bonds. But a couple of years ago, they decided to start trading crypto. And as they started, like I think all market makers start trading crypto just by kind of doing some basic arbitrage around it. But as they went deeper and deeper, they realized that a lot of the infrastructure that they develop in the context of other trading systems are directly applicable to the things in crypto. And so Jump then kind of expanded what it does. Now it does a lot of building in this space, a lot of development in this space, a lot of investing in this space at longer horizons. And that's where folks like Lucas and myself come in. We spend a lot of time trying to think about at a high level, what are Jump's portfolio companies, what do they really need? For the protocols that we're helping build, what are the real things that they're missing, and how can Jump, develop the right solutions for them? And so I think that's kind of the origin of this piece, the tokenomic or token design for serious people piece. So it's a very high level recap, and I'm sure Lucas will be able to do a much better job than me at explaining much of it. But at a very high level, we sort of saw as we talked to a lot of these different token projects that they didn't really have a good structure for thinking about tokenomics. They'd often think about tokenomics very much in a short-term way. How do I get a marketing boost? And that to us, I think, was sometimes a little bit both frustrating and enlightening. It sort of showed us that tokenomics and token design really wasn't being done in any sort of structured or systematic manner in the industry. It was in this very ad hoc, proof by anecdote, proof by example approach. And so we decided to like sit down and try and write some high-level principles that we want all token designers to abide by, and that might guide them and give them a lot more structure as they build out their protocols and their token designs. So the way we think about it is that token design should have these like two overriding principles. The first one is that we should try and have token design fund common goods. And I'm sure we'll get into over the course of the podcast like what common goods are. But at a high level, these are these positive externalities, these positive benefits that a community can create when they come together that perhaps like an individual might not be able to create on his or her own. And then the second principle of that is to make sure that value is flowing back to the people who provide it. So a lot of the tokenomic models we saw had like a little bit of an extractive flavor. The early participants did a lot of the hard work. The later yield farmers got all of the returns. That's doing it all wrong. We sort of think that the people who do the work should be compensated for doing the work, and token design should incorporate that. And then in the piece, we go through a couple of examples: gas fees, security and staking, the 3-3 design, governance, play to earn, And we use these two principles to score these various tokenomic methods and see how they do.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that's really interesting. Just to summarize, you're kind of that's mainly all come from the portfolio companies that you are looking after, right? So you've been sort of helping them design their tokenomics, or you've been reviewing it for Jump. Is that sort of the process that you go through, and then you come across these things where they might not distribute value in the right way, or it goes to the wrong sources, or they don't participate to common goods, right? Is that kind of like the mode you operate in?
That's certainly one of the key services that we provide as both an investor and a builder in the ecosystems that we care about. We very much want to see that projects are aligned in terms of their tokenomics and the types of value that they're trying to drive. In terms of the piece itself, we cover both some of the investments that we've made in the past, but also the canonical examples of certain models in the ecosystem. So for example, in a previous piece that we had on yield farming, we looked at the structure of curve tokenomics, where you can have you can have the base curve token, but you can also have the voting escrow token, which allows you to direct emissions. Similarly, in our recent piece on token design, the example of Olympus, for instance, is one model that was widely imitated throughout throughout many protocols across every chain. And the overall method there is similar between every protocol, but the originator was Olympus, so we chose to address it at that level of how you might think about this high level design, what it does, what kinds of value it contributes, and whether that's aligned with the original goals of the protocol.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's a really cool approach. So let's maybe go into these two areas, right? Into the common goods and the value flow. So can we go into that common goods again, and define that really, and think through what that would do, right? For me, common good is kind of this open source, right? You write a piece of code and it's out there, everybody can use it, but not. I mean, like all DeFi protocols or most of the decentralized stuff is kind of open source, but not all of them produce something that's really like that, right? A bunch of them are also like for profit. How does that kind of fit in? That was one of the initial questions that I had.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Common good, I think we actually think of it as a little broader than that. It need not be necessarily open source, and it need not also be like completely altruistic where the profits entirely flow to the community. Common goods, I think we actually think of are like more sort of fundamentally tied to externalities. So externalities is maybe a little bit of a jargony term, so let me explain it. It's essentially positive or negative things people create that aren't really valued by the people who create them. So let's take a couple of examples. I recently moved into a house, and part of that is I have to like maintain a front yard. And I don't have any sort of a green thumb, so it's like an awful procedure for me. And in an ideal world, I would probably just get rid of my front yard and just, mow it over with concrete. But that wouldn't be good for my neighborhood. That would make my house look ugly, sure. But that would also more generally make all of my neighbors' houses look a little uglier as well. So that would be an example of a common bad, where I do something that I perhaps value or don't value, which is get rid of my garden, and I suffer a little bit of a property loss for it. But then I impose all these externalities on my neighbors that I don't directly care about. And so what's the countermeasure? Well, at least in the non-crypto world, we often have that a lot of these things are outlawed just by decree. For instance, my HOA will say, you can't do that, you must maintain your garden to a certain standard. And then there are all sorts of other examples like this, fireworks, pollution, things where maybe the person who's generating them doesn't value entirely the sum total of all the positive or negative surplus that item creates. So in the context of tokenomics, we think that tokenomics is just a coordinating mechanism. It's a way of taking this very, very diffuse community of actors that don't know each other, don't really know how to communicate with one another, and getting them to do things in the aggregate that create lots of value for one another, even if they themselves may not value it directly. So I think one good example, and I don't want to go too much into the examples because I'm sure we'll go into it later in the podcast, but one example might just be gas fees. Imagine a world where there just are no gas fees, right? What will happen then? First, the community will have no way of coordinating what transactions are high value and low value. They'll sort of just do it in some random order. They won't create a ton of surplus. There'll be a lot of surplus left on the table. There'll be people who want to get really important trades through, and there'll be people who want to get relatively unimportant trades through, and the community will have no way of distinguishing the two. So the coordination is sort of lacking. The other problem, of course, is that that's now very vulnerable to spam. People can now just issue hundreds, thousands, millions of transactions. They'll make the system entirely unusable for everybody. It's the equivalent of me creating ugly gardens, everywhere. And so that generates no value, of course, for the spammer. They're just being adversarial. But that also then destroys all the value in the community at large, because now the community can't use the protocol to do anything worthwhile. And so gas fees are kind of the solution on both fronts. And it's one of the really canonically perfect examples of token design. It's a way of taking a bunch of anonymous people in a community together, bring them together, and say that now we can actually prioritize between high value and low value transactions, because the high value ones are bidding more. And now we have a way of deterring spammers and making the network usable for everybody, because we charge some base price that prevents spammers from overwhelming the system. So I think we think of common goods as not necessarily purely altruistic. In that example of gas fees, validators make money. There's plenty of sort of funds going around, but there is a lot of surplus that is unlocked that wouldn't be unlocked if there were no gas fees.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's a beautiful example of the way that tokenomics should work, and I just supplement it with one more drawn on my experience in New York. Being a few blocks from Central Park, that is a common and, in fact, public good that no individual participant, i.e. resident of the city, would be either incentivized or able to provide on their own, but it's something that collectively benefits everyone. Similarly, you might have resources in any crypto ecosystem, for example, a liquidity provision in DeFi, that no one individual can handle it in its entirety, but which provides benefits to all. And tokenomics, again, can serve as a coordination mechanism there, whereby individuals can participate for reasons that, because of the tokenomics, become individually rational, even though no one could have bankrolled the entire project.
Yeah, and that all with a couple of incentives, right? Put in place in the right place. So and that's, I don't know, like in the real world with Central Park, for instance, right? It doesn't work that way, right? It's more with that they implement rules and regulations, but in the crypto space, it's more like we do it with incentives, or we focus more on these incentives, right? We're going to pay you to do this. We're going to give you this leverage opportunity or whatever, arbitrage opportunity with this token. So that's really an interesting way to kind of look at it, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the traditional world, you kind of have both of those mechanisms. You can certainly use the incentive-based approach, and there are some examples. Maybe a good example might be cigarettes. You sort of think that perhaps cigarettes might generate negative externalities on people who are around the ones smoking, or maybe they generate negative externalities on the public healthcare system. So what does the government do? Well, they do some amount of banning cigarettes if you're under 18, at least in the US. But then they also do a lot of taxation. Cigarettes cost a lot more than the marginal cost of producing it. And that's like a way of sort of disincentivizing people on the margin from smoking. But governments also then do plenty of these other things, which are just rules. The HOA tells me I must maintain a garden. The city of New York tells Lucas, you're not allowed to build on Central Park. It remains a park. In crypto, you can't really do that because people are anonymous. There are a set of rules you can implement, but only within the confines of the protocol. It's much harder to implement system-wide rules, and certainly it's virtually impossible to implement it on an identity basis. If you sanction one bad actor, they'll just go and create a new account. And so that makes the incentive-based mechanisms far more powerful in crypto than the rule-based mechanisms.
Yeah.
And in addition to identity, there's this notion of decentralization, right? Why can't you typically make these sorts of sweeping rules in crypto? Because there is no natural centralized entity. The very ethos of the system is to be decentralized. So while there's governance is an excellent analogy to democracy, but the authority comes in the form of the entire system, which operates according to algorithmic rather than institutional rules.
Yeah. Because you can't really, there's no way to really enforce these rules. So we got to go with incentives to solve that problem. And that's quite interesting, right? Because we don't have that centralized entity enforcing the rules. We've kind of gone to the decentralization, and all these different protocols have come up with incentive structures, and that then makes this system of common goods, right? So I think that's sort of how I would see this, this part of your article, right? It's that all of them work together to provide that common good, but individually they might have completely different drivers, like be financial, economical, whatever. But as a whole, I think that's how it works, right? If they don't provide a common good, then people won't use it, or only in the short term for speculation, right? For these short-term gains, whatever that might be.
And that touches on.
I think a lot of.
Oh, go ahead, Nihar. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, like a lot of systems will break down in that case. And so I think you're absolutely right that you sort of need these ways of coordinating people. Without common goods, generally you think that then the system just works the way it should. If you're, people act in their self-interest. And so if you set up a design where if they do an action, they get exactly the value back that they create, you don't have to really worry too much. You don't need too clever of a design about that. The common good aspect is essential because that's where a clever protocol designer can realize in the aggregate the community doing some sort of behavior is worth a lot more than it is to each participant individually. And that's really the whole point of this token design. In the staking, I think is a good example where if I'm part of a protocol, I have no incentive to stake at all, right? If I just go and put up my tokens and say I'll secure transactions, everyone else will say thank you to me, but that'll achieve nothing. By contrast, if the protocol designer sets up a whole staking system where there are rewards flowing to stakers and stakers kind of do things in the aggregate, now everyone starts to coordinate on the good equilibrium. I decide to stake, Lucas decides to stake, everybody decides to stake, and now you've created a secure system that everybody can use and all the individual participants are rewarded for.
Yeah. Now you touched upon identity, right? And I think identity is something that I'm really interested in, especially in this space. What would change if we had identity that you couldn't just change? Do you have any thoughts on that? Would that change the equation? Would that turn it into a centralized, controllable thing? What would it do?
I think that coordination mechanisms may remain largely similar in the sense that the life of any protocol without one will be nasty, brutish, and short. But nonetheless, if you had a persistent notion of identity, you might see, on the positive side, you might see an increased impact of reputation. Right now, you can only build positive reputation through a long series of repeated actions. But if you had some tie to identity, both positive and negative reputation become possible. And people might care more not only about the explicit actions that they take on-chain, but also about their consequences off-chain or about reputational impacts on any other systems of which they are a part. That said, I mean, part of the great appeal of decentralization is that you can have anonymous participants who are voting purely based on not only their own interest, but free of any sort of coercion or any sort of external motivation that might be imposed on them otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I'll add, identity is actually one of the things that we're very interested at Jump, because we think a lot of the next wave of governance is going to need some notion of identity. And so here we want to distinguish between, often when people talk about identity, we put it in very black and white terms. Either you're completely anonymous, you're just like a hexadecimal address, or we know everything about you. We know your name, we have your social security number, your driver's license, your address. In fact, there's like a middle point that I think crypto hasn't quite found that could be very powerful. There's some work around, for instance, tying identity to some tying addresses to some fuzzy notion of identity. I think the best example perhaps are these like soul-bound tokens, this proof of personhood type mechanisms, things where you don't need to know too much about me. You just need to know enough about me to know that I'm a distinct person and it's not trivial for me to create a different address. You still may not know where I live, what I do, what I look like, but at least you know that these two addresses must be different people because there's a small barrier, a small identity-based barrier to getting multiple addresses. And we think once you do that, the design space for governance in particular unlocks greatly. there's a piece that that we put out several months ago about, for instance, quadratic or square root voting. And this is like a little bit off topic, so I won't go down the rabbit hole too much, but it is a way of just trying to prevent whales from having undue influence on the protocol. Rather than you voting with how many tokens you have, you vote with the square root of the number of tokens you have. So if you have 100 tokens and I have only 4, well, you only have 10 votes and I have 2. The difference is a little more equalized. Now, without any notion of identity, this is a very stupid system because you can always just create 100 addresses and deposit a token into each one. But with some notion of identity, even some fuzzy notion of identity, all of a sudden, this type of mechanism and a lot of similar mechanisms suddenly come on the table.
Yeah.
I would agree completely, and just add that perhaps fuzzy is one way of conceiving of it, but partial is another. And like you have not only a middle ground, but an entire spectrum of identity whereby you can attest to particular properties. For example, in the lending case, you can have a credit score, or you can have a social security number that is revealed only in case of default, or any other combination of mechanisms that expose only necessary information, but necessary and sufficient is really what you're going for in any crypto version of identity, whereby it's tailored to the protocol, to the system that you want to build.
Yeah. And then like, I think, and then where does the stickiness come from that identity, right? What prevents you from just going and creating a new one is probably the reputation that you build, right? That's kind of, you wouldn't want to give that away because it costs you like effort to build up that reputation, right? And so only if you, I mean, and also there comes in this like negative reputation, like when you misbehave in a system and like if you speed driving or drunk driving or something like that, right? You get these. Here in Australia, at least, you get these points, and then after some time, you lose your license, whatever, right? So, but then you can't just start over with a new identity, and so that's something, I guess, that would need to be built into this whole system, right?
Yes, and you might even imagine notions of identities that are illegible to other systems, yet non-fakeable within the system. For example, let's say that no other system takes the hash of my fingerprint plus a facial scan. I mean, not that I would generally want to reveal that much information as part of an identity verification, but let's say we're combining those two things, and nobody else has that form of identity. Then I sign on to a given protocol using this identity, and I can gather reputation. I care about that reputation. I can't form a new unassociated identity with this protocol if something happens with the original one. And yet this identity doesn't need to be shared with any other protocol.
Yeah, because it's tied to some biometrics that just can't be made up or changed. Yeah. I think there's so much in this space, and I think there's lots of areas that are evolving in the identity area. Also, with regards to I think like the whole reputation is something that we currently don't see, right? So to me, it's like this, you work on chain, you do all this work, people do contribute to different DAOs, they do good things, create value, but they really get nothing. And the only way to build up a reputation is kind of maybe the Twitter followers, something like that is that mechanism, but it's not very granular, and you can buy it. Like you could buy Twitter followers, or you could just like just based on creating attention, that also creates Twitter followers. But value creation doesn't necessarily. So that's something I really see that is missing, and then also transferring that between different entities. So there's lots of different, I see DAOs, they're minting these NFTs to do their reputation. Then there's the soulbound thing, there's self-sovereign identity, but there's no real standards happening at the moment, and also nothing tied to any of these biometrics. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what's coming there.
Yeah, if you had
I think in many ways. Oh, sorry, we keep clobbering each other a bit. what I was going to say is, in many ways, you've described a lot of informal mechanisms for reputation, where you kind of even if you don't have a Twitter following, if you're very active in the protocol, people associate this hexadecimal address with doing good work. But almost no protocols have embedded anything formal into it. There's a little bit of work around, I think, reputation vesting, and Lucas might know more about that than me. But for the most part, like, if you just do good work, people kind of know your address. Maybe they know your Twitter account. Maybe in rare cases they know your name. But there isn't anything where formally you have you have more power or more rights in the protocol for all of those.
It might land you a different job, right? That might be something, but that's not really formal, right? It's
I think that's an interesting case where the notion of identity in DAOs intersects partially with, let's say, the mechanisms of reward in tokenomics, but not exactly. Ideally, in a DAO, you'd want a creator portfolio that could serve as a portable, that could use, you could use as an application to other DAOs, or that you could use for additional roles within the current DAO, something that was tied to, again, exactly as much of a notion of identity as you wanted to expose, but nonetheless something that you'd maintain and carry over as a self-sovereign identity over time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, portable. I think that's the key point. And then also the negative reputation should be part of it. Like, I would want to know if that person had ripped off another DAO, or not committed to a project, or left, or I don't know, did harm in some way. Anyway, this topic is quite interesting. I think a lot of people are trying, and I feel like it's an idea that's sort of ripe within the next year or so to develop and get a lot more attention than it has.
There are all kinds of notions of reputational staking that you could build into even a semi-anonymous identity system. For example, to take your point about negative reputation, let's say that I had an anonymous creator portfolio that for which, on accepting any new job with that portfolio, I had to stake my reputation in advance on some notion of completion. Maybe if there were a dispute, it would be arbitrated by some Claros court, etc. But regardless of the mechanism, notions of pre-commitment are very similar to the notions of staking that we discussed in the tokenomics piece.
Yeah. And then you get this this aspect of like, you can build like whole networks of this, right? I could stake my reputation for you, and with that, you become credible because I'm giving you my credible. I'll lend that to you, right? And so you could build these whole networks. I've written this article on this, I think it's called the Kilt protocol. They're like this SSI protocol niche thing, I think, and they're built on creating this network of identities, and go into that aspect as well, where you can stake your reputation with others, and they can use that to issue documents, whatever.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing is a lot of these personhood type mechanisms where you just have these like sort of very diffuse social networks, and I may not know your name, but I know that a buddy of mine knows a buddy of mine vouches for you, so that may or may not be good enough.
It's kind of what LinkedIn does, right? LinkedIn. I'm not a big fan of LinkedIn, but what they do, they have this system of you can endorse someone else, and that, depending on who endorsed you, if that person then has a lot of endorsements in the field that he endorsed you with, that gives it more credibility. And so there's this, once you have such a network, there's these interesting effects that you can build up on proving how good such an endorsement is, if you know what I mean, right? It's you could easily use this kind of system, and I don't know to what degree they do, but that's something that's it's quite interesting, I think.
LinkedIn endorsements are a particularly interesting example in that, in theory, they amount to a sort of page rank in social networks or in work, where your reputation follows you based on the reputations of those who endorse you. In practice, LinkedIn endorsements usually aren't regarded as particularly valuable, and this is because not only can they be given lightly, but they also have no notion of verifiability. So that's actually one of the use cases where you could imagine a crypto solution being naturally better in the sense of linking by default to whatever documentation is available, similarly to how if a developer has a public GitHub, you can evaluate the quality of their projects immediately.
Yeah. I mean, you would still have to go through some process in finding out the quality of the thing, right? Stars and a GitHub repo is not the main. You can also buy that or fake that. But yeah, I agree. And then, yeah, I wrote this piece like a year ago or 2 years ago, I don't know, on how you could source all that information, because there's so many different systems that have it. There's LinkedIn, there's GitHub, there might be like a ton of others, freelancer platforms. You could source all that and sort of put that all into one place, an identity somewhere. And that would be then a really cool, I guess, CV replacement, right? Because it'd be much more credible if you have like your whole GitHub repo where it sources information from, maybe where it's used, where it's deployed, then the whole LinkedIn thing, all the gigs that you've done if you did on freelancer platforms, whatnot. But anyway,
and for what it's worth, I'll just add, we actually see that quite a bit at Jump now, when people, more often than not, when we start to get resumes, they look less and less like the traditional resumes of the old days, and they'll much more have like the projects they work on and the ways those projects have been used.
Okay, we're seeing a shift there already.
No longer is somebody's GPA in college or something at the top of the page. Now we're starting to see like actual
what you've been working on, which I think is a lot better. I don't know why we stuck around with that for so long.
Well, you can't staple every project to your CV. When credentialing is replaced by documentation, it creates a better outcome for everyone.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And then if it's verifiable immediately, that would make it a lot cooler, right? Because I think if you now have these CVs with all these projects in it, and you are the one looking through them, it just causes a lot of time, right? Because how do you know if it's any good? So if you can verify that in some way, make it really cool, really great system, I think. Then, yeah.
Uh-huh.
All right, we went down this rabbit hole a little bit, even though we didn't want to. So then the other aspect of your piece, right, to get back to that now, is this value creation, right? So you create value and it somehow should flow back. Could you walk us through that again, a little bit more detail? I think it's very obvious within proof of work, right? You validate transactions, or proof of stake, you validate transactions and create that block, and then you get some reward for it, right? You get some of the transaction fee maybe in that case. But how about you also talked about DAOs. I think in DAOs, do you have any examples on how that would work there? You create some value and how that would then flow back to the creator potentially? Yeah.
So I guess actually before we go into DAOs, I'll even go back to the proof of work, proof of stake example. That's even one where at least I sort of think we don't do as good a job giving value to those who create it. And by that I mean, in a lot of cases, there are often miners, let's just take proof of work to make it concrete, there are a lot of miners who expend computational effort and don't come first. And they, in many ways, did a good job securing the system. They put in time, they put in computing cycles, and they get nothing for it. Now, of course, if you're a big miner, that's not a problem. Probabilistically, over the long haul, you will earn the expected value of your rewards. Once in a while, you'll miss. Once in a while, you'll get it. Kind of averages out. But if you're a small miner, I mean, sure, probabilistically, if you do it over 200 years, you might win the reward every now and then. In practice, you're just going to get frustrated and you're going to stop. And so we see actually a lot of consolidation of mining pools for precisely, I imagine, this reason, which is that, A, of course, it's a more professional operation and you can get some sort of scale effects that way. But B, you actually don't have value flowing to the people who are creating it in a highly decentralized system. So your system tends to a little bit over-centralize. Now, this might be a minor thing to nitpick because we've certainly seen other protocols that have worse examples of value creation. And proof of work and proof of stake gets pretty close to the ideal. But even there, I think we can partially blame the over-centralization on that like lack of giving value to the people who put in the hard work but don't always get there first.
Yeah, because operations such as mining have been typically grouped, right? It just makes more sense. Economies of scale.
They've been grouped, right, and they sort of like economies of exactly. And so like you just incentivize the slightly wrong metric.
Turning to the example of DAOs, I think in the case where you have human contributors doing jobs explicitly, bounded contractual pieces of work, that can be an extremely natural mapping when it's clear approximately how much a given feature or a given contribution is worth. You simply dispense a certain amount of grant tokens to them, and often you see this in a subcommittee or working group structure that essentially replicates the traditional organizational structure in a distributed setting. You can also see pretty natural mappings where governance is concerned, even though I don't think this has been implemented so much in practice. So, for example, one of the things that we cover in the piece is that people typically don't get credit for writing governance proposals. It would be slightly subtle to design a good way to reward governance proposals because, of course, if you just gave a certain amount for every proposal, people would spam proposals. And similarly, any metric that can be gamed generally will be because people bear no downside for doing so.
Yeah.
That said, perhaps you could invent a metric that would hold up as a reasonably good proxy, even under Goodhart's law of people trying to manipulate the metric being measured. So I would guess that rather than rewarding the number of governance proposals, rewarding the amount of engagement with a given governance proposal, at least if it was hard to sybil the engagement as well, that could provide a better means of alignment for distributing token rewards to people who provided governance value to the platform.
Or like the impact, if you could. I don't know how you would measure it, right? But maybe the impact of the governance proposal. We'll look into it in a year's time and see what it has done to the overall stats of this DAO protocol.
Yeah, that might be. I imagine that one would just be really hard to measure in practice. A, because you'll probably be passing tons of governance proposals, and B, there'll be proposals that fail, so you'll never have the counterfactual what would happen. But that being said, I think engagement is, I think, a very good example of where there's a lot of subtlety because, maybe token designers or protocol designers might say, let's do something simpler. I agree, people who write governance proposals aren't rewarded. Let's just have the ones that pass. If your governance proposal passes, it meant you wrote a good governance proposal, you get some extra bonus. And that's probably a good thing on face value. But what will that incentivize then? Well, that'll incentivize the layups. That'll incentivize the really easy sort of steps that the protocol should take because then, they get voted in by a big margin and so on. And that's good, nothing wrong with that. But that won't incentivize true risk-taking. Like a good protocol should be debating a lot of governance proposals, and they should be vetoing a good chunk of them. If you're not vetoing or failing enough governance proposals, you probably aren't looking at the full distribution of risky proposals. You're only looking at the really, really safe local maxima type stuff. So a good protocol should actually incentivize a lot of proposals that get engagement, that get careful thought, and that are ultimately failed as a metric that they're really taking risks out there. And so that's where engagement actually might be closer to what you really want. You want a lot of people debating, arguing, comparing notes, and then whether it succeeds or fails, at least you did a good job stretching, your imagination for what the
Actually, the curve wars are a fairly good example of what happens in a way when you incentivize only what passes, in the sense that curve voting for a given gauge is, well, every vote passes, but that means that you get an entire bribery layer with Votium or other services that simply distribute the rewards among the voters for the proposal and thus incentivize success without real reference to the value contributed to the protocol. Of course, in Curve's case, by and large, you still do have valuable things being accomplished by the gauge voting in that the most valuable gauges with the most fees get the most votes allocated to them. But nonetheless, if you simply incentivize success, sometimes you get perverse consequences. And in the case where you incentivize only successful governance proposals, not only, as Nihar mentioned, would you have the problem that you disincentivize all risky proposals, and you fail to recognize the value of rejected proposals, you also get the engineer's fallacy, where you only value what can be measured, and this applies even if you go for impact. So that in that sense, it's difficult to fully remove the human element. We can only get a series of increasingly better approximations.
Yeah, and and I think we can try and get as close to that as sort of possible, right? With this reward flowing back. I think like it's something that a lot of communities are just like struggling with, right? Because it's often not just voting or proposals, but it's often also this natural type of work. So I see it in Bankless DAO, right? So they got this token, which gives everybody ownership, and that should ideally incentivize them to work towards this greater mission of Bankless DAO, onboarding all these people, because if they do, the number of the token goes up. That's the whole idea of it, right? Because the pay that you really get is not that much. It's not going to pay your bills. So the idea, so give you a really concrete example, right? I wrote an article for them and spent like 20 hours, and I got 4,000 bank token, and they were worth, I don't know, $50. So not really good use of my time in the end. But the idea is like, if I keep these tokens and I continue, I've got skin in the game in this thing. I keep building up this thing, and then the token goes up at some point, and I've contributed to it in some way. So I think in these cases, it's like really hard to measure this reward flowing back of when it becomes bigger, right? Because you don't know which of these articles was the one that made it that far, right? Because you just get this like fixed payment. But what if you wrote the article that got like the million reads? That's not factored in. So
yes, and I would say even a big chunk of that is even independent of the value that the articles create. If you notice in that example, or let's just say like you have a stock of tokens, you tell your friends about the protocol, they go and get involved, and that benefits the protocol. If you notice, like there's a very small difference between me doing all the work and getting all my friends to get on the protocol, and Lucas, perhaps in this example, who has a bunch of tokens that he holds passively, just sitting and waiting for me to do all the work. Because in both cases, the reward that we gain is actually mostly proportional to the stocks that we held in the token ahead of time, as opposed to the true effort that we put in. So like this sort of mechanism will end up, maybe incentivizing really big holders to put in the effort, like the founding team and so on. But your average token holder might say, for every $100 I bring to the platform, I get to see 1/1000th of a penny. So like, what's that worth? Whereas a more like targeted referral system, I think, would hit both of our concerns. It would then, if you actually created a lot of value, it would actually reward you for that value. And in the same vein, if I didn't hold a big stock of tokens, but I created a lot of value for the platform would pass.
How would that targeted referral system work? Like can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess I don't know enough about
anything will do.
Particular model to maybe weigh in on that. But yeah, any sort of token model. Right? It might just be that when you join a protocol, you have to kind of credit the address that brought you on board, or something like that. Even something as simple as that. Like every Web2 company has generally figured out a referral program, and that is like a good alignment of incentives that crypto probably can use. Now, I'm sure, like if we sat here for a little more time, we could come up with more clever ways of doing this. For instance, maybe if you had different proposals or different governance proposals that you were trying to get passed, there might be like staking in governance or something like that. So if your proposal gets passed, you get some lion's share of the rewards. There are like other ways we could think about, I'm sure, like more tightly linking outcomes to the effort put in. But I think even this is like one good example where the system kind of has like a high level metric that makes a lot of sense, but then the devil is in the details, and just saying bring people to the platform that'll benefit all of us isn't strong.
The one other interesting subtlety here is when you are issuing token denominated rewards, do you use them as simply FX for a cash payment stream, or do you treat them as building an increased stake in the platform? And I think most protocols ultimately are trying to align incentives, and so they favor the latter.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, and yeah, I don't know. That's probably the whole idea of what they're all talking about, right? Is this like we're giving away ownership, and you'll be an owner of Bankless DAO. So yeah, and it's something I've been like thinking about for quite some time, because I worked for big tech, and there you'll get shares, right, of that corporation. And of course, if you work 100 hours a week, you add a lot of value, share price doesn't budge. If you do nothing at all, share price doesn't budge, right? There's nothing really happening there, because I think the thing has gotten too big for you to have an impact. So this mechanism of ownership somehow, like, I think the larger you get, the less relevance it has. So I think that's a huge problem that a lot of these DAOs will also run into. So it becomes a weaker and weaker incentive mechanism to me. And I don't really know how to solve it, but it should be in a way that if you're kind of like a product manager, right, and you're responsible for launching a new product within this this DAO or large corporation or whatever, you'd launch kind of like a sub token, and that would give you then ownership in this specific initiative, and where you can have upside and downside in what happens with it. So you have this like increased skin in the game that you wouldn't otherwise have if you wouldn't have that system. You just put one person into it and say like, okay, you develop this product, you're the owner of it, but he wouldn't really have any of this in the skin of the game, even though he would hold tokens or he would be paid tokens, because it's uncertain what impact it would have, right?
I think not only does it increase your skin in the game, but to revisit our framework, it increases your alignment with the part of the platform to which you're contributing value. The issue that you're describing is essentially as a platform grows in total value, necessarily the amount that it can give out for any given task decreases. And so it's difficult to affect the value of the platform as a whole. But if you know that with a sub-token you are affecting the particular part of the platform that you are striving to improve, then not only will you likely work harder on it, but you will realize those rewards more directly and immediately.
Yeah. So have you seen that anywhere, this type of system, this type of setup?
One that I saw somewhat recently is Helium. So I imagine most folks are familiar with Helium, but as a recap, it's the protocol that's coordinating the rollout of these sort of home or decentralized internet devices or internet hotspots. So they sort of have had like a large network of these low power, long range networks, but now they want to move to 5G. And so, there's sort of two ways you could implement that move. One way is like the old fashioned way, just like start going for that and start incentivizing and use the same token to incentivize that. They've gone the second way, which is the one we're discussing. They've actually issued, or they're in the process of issuing, a token called Mobile. And that's like a separate token from their original native token, or it's a sub-token that then converts back up into the top-level token that is just designed around rewarding and incentivizing the rollout of the 5G network and the 5G.
And then how does it roll back up?
And at the same time, so at the same time, there's a second token that they're issuing, which is the IoT token, and that's for continued development of their original network. So that's their long-range, low-power, the stuff that's good for Internet of Things, but maybe not for your cell phone. And so now you have these like two sub-DAO tokens that then roll up into being able to purchase the original, call it reserve token, the HNT, the HNT token. And to some degree, they've almost set up a little bit of a horse race. Like, whichever token does better will convert back into the reserve token at a more favorable valuation. So now the community can kind of pick, they can kind of invest. They can say, I'm really passionate about the 5G roadmap, so I'm going to try and accrue a lot of tokens that way. And if that person's efforts and more generally the 5G community's efforts are very successful, they will get a lion's share of the outstanding emissions of the reserve token. at the expense of the people who are trying to invest in the other thing. And so that is actually, I think, a much tighter way of linking outcomes to actual performance, rather than just in this fuzzy, we want to now do 2 initiatives, everybody gets tokens. They're instead saying, like, we're going to put these 2 initiatives almost a little bit competitively, and the better one.
That's a really interesting model, right? Where you kind of bring up your own team against each other and have this natural competition.
Yeah, it's a little adversarial.
So how does the value accrue to the token? In the case of the 5G thing, for instance, how does the value kind of flow back into that sub-initiative?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure of the mechanics of the sub-DAOs. I know at the high level, the way it works is if you want to actually use Helium or you want to use like one of the data providing services, you have to buy tokens and then burn them with the original parent treasury. And so that's at a high level how the model accrues value. I don't exactly know how like the emission schedules for these 2 sub-DAO tokens work. And so
I think it's maybe I can find someone who's interested in evaluating this protocol, Helium, and check out how these different tokens, because it sounds really interesting. I think that's a very interesting problem to solve in a lot of other DAOs or ecosystems or communities in general. Yeah. Cool. Anything else in the reward redistribution that we should cover?
I feel like we can always talk about Ohm's reward redistribution.
That's cool.
I know Lucas certainly has thoughts on that one, but I don't know if I want to put him on
in terms of reward redistribution, I think perhaps the one other interesting topic that we covered in the article but haven't discussed here yet is play to earn. And I think this offers a very interesting case of how the good and bad of tokenomics tend to intersect. So, let's say that there is an intrinsic utility on move to earn, for example. You're becoming healthier. Perhaps there would be corporate or health sponsors willing to contribute value to the platform on that basis. But in terms of how move to earn is typically realized, you have maybe some token or NFT gated program, and this is a scarce supply. Both the NFTs or whatever the access pass is and the tokens themselves are somewhat in scarce supply, and the lion's share are accumulated by the early participants on the platform. And so this is something that I think we're still developing the formalizations around, but in a way you want to target your tokenomics as specifically as possible. That is, not only do you want to ask what or whom do we want to reward, you also want to ask how much do we want of the metric that we're targeting, or to what threshold do we want to incentivize certain behaviors. So there are some protocols for example, for swaps, AMMs, DEXs, the farming platforms, etc., where instead of incentivizing as much TVL as possible with simple linear emissions, there are rewards up to a certain level that decrease after that threshold. And this requires a protocol to have a notion of what the right amount is. But as long as they do have such a notion, they can say, okay, we reward steeply up to a certain point and quickly declining thereafter, because we don't want to distribute our efforts on something that is not necessary. We don't want to waste incentives, of which there is always a limited supply, on activity that we don't need in the protocol.
Yeah. So kind of once that bootstrapping is done, they taper off and stop the distribution.
Yes. So in general, tokenomics make a very effective solution to the cold start problem through distribution of ownership in advance. But once they've solved the cold start problem, they should fall off in some way. And by and large, the vast majority of protocols that we've observed haven't really thought about that yet, because getting the 0 to 1 is the first priority. But I think as we focus on the 1 to N and sustainable systems where there is a steady state after the marketing budget, for lack of a better word, is exhausted, you really do need that one to N stage where the things that don't need to be incentivized aren't.
Yeah, yeah. And so,
and I'll add that, in many ways we find out the protocol designers we speak to are really good about thinking about the cold start problem. They understand they have to be like generous and aggressive in accumulating customers. But I think we joke sometimes that they need to also think about the cold restart problem, which is, sometime down the road, crypto winter may set in, their protocol may fall out of favor, they may need a redesign to overhaul things, and if you've already given away all of the treasury tokens at that point,
that's it, you're done.
You'll have to rebuild from scratch, and that's much more painful. And so, so we encourage them to actually be more judicious about, thinking about marketing as having some very, very fixed lifetime, and then moving on to keeping tokens.
So who's done that well? Who's done that in a way that you'd say, hey, that was really good. You've done the cold start. You've seen that you've started it, but then you've stopped.
There,
I see a niche there.
There are a few examples of, the DeltaFi is one that I recall that handles the TVL problem in the way that I just described. There are a couple of others which I'm forgetting at the moment, but essentially the tokenomics do fall off after a certain level of TVL is reached in a given pool or in a given part of the system. And if you implement that more broadly, then you can really establish a framework that carries over the analogy from Web 2 of CAC, LTV, churn, all of these traditional customer concepts. To frame it in another way, if you have these unlimited tokenomic distributions that continue after the thing that they need to incentivize has been realized, you're essentially paying infinite CAC that's, or at least CAC that linearly scales with time. And you really want to pay it once and be done.
Yeah, true. And hopefully have it running in a sustainable way then, right? So it would be something KPI bound that would be the current common approach. Right?
Target
so tie it to some TVL, and then it tapers off. And you can even do that, I guess, algorithmically in probably like most of the DeFi cases. I think for, I don't know, maybe for DAOs, it could be some revenue figures. That's an interesting
Lifinity,
thing.
that
right?
was the one I was trying to think of.
What was that? Sorry.
Lifinity.
Lifinity. Okay. Yeah. Haven't heard of that one. I'll look it up and link it in the notes. That's definitely something interesting because I see, currently the focus in tokenomics is really mainly on, let's get a token out there, let's design it. So a lot of the clients or the people I talk to, that's their problem, right? We want to launch a token, but not a lot of them are working on this post-launch. We've launched our token. Let's review not only the monetary policy, but also the incentives, the mechanisms, this whole design in terms of like, how is the actual business or the project or the protocol going? And does that require any change? And I think that's something I see as hopefully more and more we'll get into. So last week I talked to Iced Cool from Bankless DAO, and the way they do it, right? They have a tokenomics department within Bankless DAO, and they kind of just figure out what the different problems are that come from the ecosystem, and they write proposals on it. And then the community can decide, hey, this is something that we want to implement. So they might go and write a proposal on a VE model for Bankless DAO and describe with which different departments this model or this VE token could be implemented to achieve certain goals. And then the community can decide if they want to implement it or not. And so that's something I think hopefully more and more we'll get into, this like post-launch stuff.
I think we're quite confident that we will see more sophisticated and long and far-sighted models over time. Mostly to this point, it's the foundational or the 0 to 1 design issues that predicate mere existence. So do you have a sensible distribution between the team and the investors and the community and the treasury? Do you have an inflation schedule that is capped at any given point in time? Do you have enormous unlocks that introduce disequilibriums to the system? Like all of these are very much first order issues that have to be solved before the long-term balance can be considered. But now that I think generally teams have at least a decent idea of what they should do versus what they shouldn't do on the first order issues, they can start considering the second order ones.
Yeah, because they've gone past it, right? Once you've distributed it, that's it. Unless you mint new tokens.
That's it. Yeah, and that's where I think we maybe have learned some bad lessons from Web 2. Like for Web 2, let's take as a good example Facebook. They didn't really care about revenue when they launched. They were just in complete customer acquisition mode. And so they just purely invested in that, didn't care about anything else. And then later on in the life cycle of the business, well, they figured out how to actually monetize it and put ads onto the platform and so on. But Web3 doesn't have that luxury, right? When Web2 wants to do that, well, guess what? Zuckerberg has all of the voting control effectively under his personal account. So he can pivot decisions like that very easily. Web3 is the opposite. If you had a successful launch, you probably have very little residual power left with the founding team. And so now you have to coordinate this very diffuse, decentralized community for big business decisions that try and keep the protocol sustainable. And that's so much harder. So in many ways, Web3 has a much higher bar, which is they have to think about sustainability from the start.
Yeah.
Another analogy of bad lessons from Web 2 would be blitzscaling. I mean, there are plenty of companies that essentially in the traditional technology framework, you raise a large amount from investors. This enables you to get a head start, build a moat, and assure your position as the front runner in that vertical. And then you can figure out monetization once you have a business model locked in, once essentially you've established that lead over your competitors. But the danger of using the blitzscaling approach from the outset is that you may never think about an economic model at all, or at least not until it's too late. This is sometimes less of a problem in Web 2 because, just as Nihar said, you kind of have opportunities for reset in the middle. But with crypto, if you're decentralized, unless you choose to launch another token, you can be stuck with the design choices that you made at the very start. So you really do have to give some thought to it up front.
Yeah. And I don't know if we're making our lives a lot harder than they would have already been in launching business or project this way, right? Because it just takes so much effort and energy in the beginning to think this all through, and you could focus that energy in actually building the product, and that's why I don't know what ways there are around it, but I think that's also something interesting to solve in the years to come, right?
One would hope it's like, oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's no, I was just going to say it's kind of a shame, but I will say that the positive news is when it comes to technical development, we see a lot of that. Like a lot of the protocols we talk to, they've built their product from an engineering point of view to handle millions and if not billions of transactions. But the problem is then when it comes to these other things like governance, tokenomics, and so on, they just sort of slap the standard model on and hope that it carries them through. And it's kind of a shame to see just such finely engineered pieces of metal, coupled with such bizarre
Also, having said all that doom and gloom about having to predict the future up front, it's not necessarily that bad because good governance can fix bad tokenomics to an extent. It just requires the alignment of the community. So, for example, this isn't a direct example of DAO governance, but I'd say Ethereum, had a problem with gas fees being astronomical last year. They were still astronomical after the implementation of EIP 1559, which broke the gas into the base plus priority model. But nonetheless, much less bad than it was. That was an immensely complicated change for the Ethereum community as a whole. But nonetheless, it was negotiated post facto. This EIP 1559 was not anticipated at the outset, like when Vitalik released the white paper for Ethereum. Nonetheless, it was eventually implemented and it fixed the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's actually a good example, right, of these post-launch tokenomics. They went in and changed stuff after problems they've seen. But yeah, not a lot of protocols are at this stage, or I think it's like not a topic that is very well covered in terms of what they do to change things. I'm sure we'll see that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But you just take a lot of risks that if your community doesn't support it or doesn't see it or is just fractured. I mean, we've seen it time and time again with all sorts of forks between, different L1s. That if you had just picked the right sort of plan from the beginning, or at least some right transition plan, that's much easier than putting it up for a vote and then having people split off into factions and so on. So like good governance can fix bad token design, but the thing that can fix bad token design even better is just like some thinking ahead of time, some foresight.
So I talked to this this one guy from some fund, and he told me like in the beginning they weren't really seeing tokenomics as an actual field of innovation, right? They were seeing like, the protocols, they were doing a lot of great stuff, but tokenomics isn't really. They thought it would be, there's going to be this one model, we're going to slap it onto everything, and that's it, right? It's going to be like shares, like equity, right? Where you pretty much have the same model for everything. And it turned out that they quickly found out that it's not that way, that, like there's lots of innovation in the space of tokenomics. So you also mentioned sustainable tokenomics. What are you seeing in this field as kind of emerging innovations? Where do you see it heading? What are your thoughts on that?
So I guess on my side, I think governance is probably the place I'm like most excited about the future. So I think like governance has a lot of potential, but too often we see tokenomics, or we see protocols that like design a complicated system and then just again slap on a layer of, if there are changes, governance will handle that, without thinking much about like what that sentence means. But we are seeing like a lot of changes. So I think like the one token, one vote model is obviously not great, and I think we all understand that gives disproportionate disproportionate power to whales, gives disproportionate power to short-term holders. And so like VE, I think, is an excellent innovation in this respect. And it seems like this sort of more general lockup strategy is likely to stay. Now, it's not going to be perfect, and we've seen with Curve and Convex that if the VE mechanics are too effective, somebody will just build a protocol on top that sort of does a lot of that aggregation for you. So fine. Yeah, so it doesn't get you out of the trap, but it is like a good design, and it's certainly for more nascent protocols that don't have yet the like sort of bandwidth or the attention to have a convex thing built on top. VE can be excellent. So we see so I think I'm excited about that. I'm also excited about a lot of the topics we touched on previously about some fuzzy notion of identity that allows you to then implement a lot of these quadratic voting type solutions. For too long, whenever we talk about quadratic voting, people just say, oh, it's not Sybil resistant. But that's a little bit lazy. That's kind of very much constraining the design space just because of like one feature that is admittedly very hard to overcome, but not impossible. So I think like we do see more and more promising work around these like notions of fuzzy identity, these like snapshot type voting registers and so on, things that basically try to prevent the Sybil attack and therefore can implement a much more like community-driven approach. We already see that a little bit, I guess, in practice, but it tends to be like mostly via the PR mechanism. I think one good example is when Wonderland was having those issues back in February of this year. If you recall, I think something like over half the community, or at least over half the votes, had decided to. Now I can't recall if it was to keep Wonderland operational or to shut it down. But it turns out that just a couple of whales had been driving that vote, and that actually the entire community at large had preferred the other side. And so that's like one example where without intervention, you would just have this like vote that's effectively decided by a handful of people. But of course, then the community managed to generate a lot of outrage, and they sort of blunted the worst of that plan and so on. But I think if we can embed those mechanisms into the actual tokenomic,
yes, I think there is really great scope to use mechanism design to prevent whale-centric voting or generally the accumulation of concentrated stake as a means of control in a way that, for example, Web 2 has completely failed to do with the dual share class method of maintaining a centralized control. And I mean, sometimes that's great for speed of execution and all, but in crypto, you have to have the opposite by default. And so you can also build in mechanisms that prevent the permanent control of the system by one party. And actually, to complement your point, Nihar, now that you've mentioned VE, I have to mention vesting. So there are ways to integrate this identity spectrum, volunteering a given amount of information with different notions of commitment to the system. So vote escrow is one means of commitment in the sense that you are locking up your tokens for a certain amount of time. You're saying, I have confidence in this platform. I care about it to this extent, and so give me some voting power. And you can also have an inverse mechanism like implemented by Platypus and some others that's more of a reputation vesting. It's a yield vesting in Platypus's case, but the overall concept is that you start at a low level, vest up to full voting power or yield boosting or what have you, and then you're fully committed to the system. But if you ever withdraw, then you lose all of that stake at once. And so it's interesting how you can travel in either direction, but still embed some notion of commitment. And I think that will be even more powerful once we have different and really scalable notions of identity on chain, because then you can decide how much of your reputation you want to commit to what type of mechanism. I don't know where we'll end up on that, but I think the combination will be very powerful.
Yeah. That's going to be. It kind of needs that identity for that to happen, but once it's there, we can use it. And like the ladder mechanism that you have really reminds me of what Web 2 has, right? The corporate structure. It's like you get shares vested all the time, but if you resign, they're gone.
Exactly.
And if you stay, you're going to get paid out, right? And you can only do that with an employment contract. You can't do that with a DAO where you get your tokens, right? So yeah, that's I think is really required for that to be implemented. But then, yeah, reinventing the old world in a way again, with fancier tools. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the old world, obviously, there's a lot of things wrong with the old world, but we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Like, the old world, maybe more by sort of legal, by legal sanction than anything else, found out ways of generally having good incentive alignment. And in many ways, I often think that the tokenomic challenge of crypto is bringing a lot of those principles, but doing it in an incentive, a pure sort of decentralized incentive-based mechanism.
One of the greatest benefits of crypto as an industry is lowering barriers to entry, in the sense that if you are a developer and you like a protocol and it's open source, you can just fork it. Now, of course, most of the time you do this, it's derivative, but if you have a key addition to make, then it can be transformative. And in particular, this prevents the ossification of a given model that is 90% good bundled with 10% bad, because as long as somebody's aware of what that 90% good is, they can just extract the relevant part, turn it into an independent service that otherwise parallels the original, and off they go.
Yeah. And that can be then, the breakthrough that was required, right? Maybe not with the old protocol, but with the new one, definitely can. Cool. Yeah. I know that we're kind of on the top of the time that we had assigned to this. So anything that we've missed, kind of we haven't covered in the article that you guys want to run through, mention, bring on before we wrap it up? We could probably do another hour because I've got a lot more things that we, like Olympus, whatever. But I'm sure that will bring us into some rabbit holes. So, yeah, I
think we've ranged pretty wide.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think we ranged wide. I mean, I probably just want to emphasize that, we see a lot of tokenomic designs, and the good news is I think Lucas and I probably would agree that they keep getting better. Every month brings a new set of tokenomic designs that we see, and they are improving. And maybe some part of it is like we learn the mistakes of the past. Maybe some part of that is in bear markets. There's a little less of a frenzy to rush projects out, and people spend a bit more time thinking about it. But I certainly remember like a year ago, we'd see projects that have very, very, let's call them bizarre tokenomic designs. We see fewer of those now. We do more tinkering on the margins and less like arguing for an entire rethink. And that is promising because, like as we keep going, there'll certainly be a lot of topics we don't know about like collectively as a community. And I kind of feel like we're getting very close to that frontier of now like going well beyond the types of models and designs that we came.
Yeah, I'd really just like to drive home that point that bear markets are good for building, because even when we're speedrunning financial history, in a bull market, there are nearly irresistible tendencies that even the best intentioned protocols are pressured to favor certain things that enhance short-term attention, maybe because they wouldn't even clear the threshold without it. Whereas in a bear market, you have to be committed to things that will survive in the long term, because you can't design them for the short term. It will do you no good. And so the bear market is, it not only washes out whatever didn't need to be there, but it also encourages all of the best tendencies for long-term design.
Yeah. Bear market kind of, it just makes you think long-term. That's what it does. And that reflects in token designs, in the build of the protocol, in everything. So I think it's really good. And I hope it will stick this time a little bit longer, this view on fundamentals and sustainable token design, as you called it. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, we hope that it's not in the context of a bear market, that we just have
I should say,
sustainable token design in good times and bad times too.
Yeah.
But for now,
I think it'd be like a little bit,
we'll take the gifts as they come.
that sticks every time, that we can then carry over, and then we've forgotten in the bull run a lot of it. But then in the next bear market, we kind of like build on it. And so there's this incremental evolution sort of this design getting better and better.
As the size grows, the relative swings get smaller, and eventually you approach stability.
Yeah.
So the more crypto matures, the better these models will be.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Cool, guys. This was really interesting. Where can people find you? Subscribe to the stuff that you're going to publish next. I'm sure it's going to be interesting and worth reading.
Yeah. No, thanks. I think there's actually a bigger research team behind us at Jump. So probably the best way to see all of that content is to look at Jump's Twitter account, which is at @Jump_. But then in addition, Lucas and I, you can always follow us. Mine is my Twitter handle is at
Sans Gravitas.
Shaw spelled SHA.
And probably the best way to find us is you can just go to the Jump Crypto site to read some of our posts. There are a lot of compositions from the entire research team, all of which we'd love to highlight. And feel free to reach out to us anytime.
Cool. I'll link all of that, so don't worry writing it down. But anyway, this was great fun, guys. Thanks for taking the time. All right, cool.
Thanks so much.
This podcast was not financial or tax advice. This channel is strictly educational and is not investment advice or a solicitation to buy or sell any assets or to make any financial decisions. This video is not tax advice. Talk to your accountant, do your own research. None of this is legal advice. This podcast is strictly educational. Talk to your lawyer.